we go. Welcome, everyone. It's so wonderful to have you today. We are now kicking off officially for the first time a new series here from Eastern State Penitentiary Historic Site. It's called Justice 101. And in this series, we're going to have conversations throughout the year, really looking at mass incarceration, looking at the prison system and the criminal justice system. These are very powerful conversations and a part of who we are here at Eastern State Penitentiary. So before we dive into it, my name is Kerry Sautner. I'm the president and CEO here at Eastern State Penitentiary, and it's wonderful to have you all on this conversation. We are so lucky that this series is something that we can launch once a month and really engage in our mission here at Eastern State, which I want to be really clear and direct and read it to you all very loud. It's about exploring our history and the current work in the criminal justice reform in America. And our goal through these programs is about increasing awareness, education, and understanding of the criminal justice reform movement and its impact on policy in our lives today. So this series is going to bring this through us throughout the months. But kicking this off in January is such an important time to do that because we get to look at the intention of how these programs will be run. We look at January, we look at this week as the week that we celebrate the birthday of Martin Luther King Jr. And one of the key teachings of Martin Luther King Jr. is to look at our society, look at each other with respect, with compassion, and with dignity and hope for humankind. But also not to forget that all of our work, if we want to change anything and we want to do anything, takes us, takes the humans to do that. So that is the purpose and the point of the Justice 101 series, to look at criminal justice reform, but with that lens of respect for all people, compassion for their dignity and welfare, and a conviction that we all believe in positive change and that it requires us to do that. So collectively, we're going to work together to learn, to ask questions, and to engage with each other on these difficult conversations. So thank you all for being here for this launch. But also, what a better way to launch this than with one of my favorite teachers, Professor Hasan Jeffries. So Professor Hasan Jeffries, thank you so much for being here today.
No, of course. Thank you for having me, and congratulations on the taking over the leadership at Eastern. I'm looking forward to helping and partnering with you as you continue to really guide and lead this amazing institution into the 21st century.
Thank you. I know I'm sitting in a room, in a building, in a site that's from the 1820s and reminding myself on a daily basis how these stories from that time period and the founding of America, which this was really the genesis of, was in the founding of America, applies today and the questions that we're still struggling with today. So thank you for that. Now, students, I want you to all know a little bit about Professor Jeffries and why he's my favorite teacher. You'll learn in the next 30 minutes because he's an amazing teacher. But he's a professor of history at Ohio State University, and he teaches courses on the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement. He is born in Brooklyn, New York. And, you know, as a Philadelphian, we have a lot of, a little bit of a rivalry with New York, but I let you totally go on that one. Because what I love from all of my teachers that are from New York is that you speak at the same pace that most Philadelphians do, which everybody else tells us to slow down. So we will try to speak slower today, but it will be a fun movement. But he graduated from Morehouse College with a BA in history. And he earned his Ph.D. in American history with a specialization in African American history from Duke University. Hasan has written amazing books. One of my favorites is Buddy Lowndes. It's The Civil Rights and Black Power in the Alabama Black Belt. It's a great book. Another favorite, especially for our teachers in the room, he was the chief editor of Understanding and Teaching the Civil Rights Movement. This is a collection of essays by leading civil rights scholars. And what I love about that piece is it really helps you teach how to teach it to middle schoolers and high schoolers with great primary sources. And Hasan, I hear that you're working on a new book on the civil rights movement, In the Shadow of Civil Rights. Would you like to talk about that real quick for a second?
Yeah, I'm excited about it. It's, in a way, it's an extension of my first book, Bloody Lowndes, which looks at civil rights and the struggle for what I call freedom rights in the South during the 60s. And this sort of looks at what happens to the struggle for civil rights, a little bit about what we're going to talk about after the heyday, after the high point Black protests in the 60s and 70s. So it looks at the shadow of civil rights, using New York City as a prism in the late 70s, early 80s, up to the early 90s.
And I think that's a perfect connection to the conversation today, because we tend to look at American history as these big bang moments, these moments that happen over time. And this, letter from a Birmingham jail, which I know we're going to dive into today. And students and participants, please ask questions in the Q&A. Allie and Jerome will make sure that they get to me, and then I'll make sure that they get to Professor Jeffries. But it isn't about just these moments in time, especially for the civil rights movement. It's really looking at that long piece of American history, of human history, and the struggle for civil rights. So maybe we can start with that framing there and give us your perspective on how we should understand the civil rights movement. And then we can dive into the civil rights movement and its connection to criminal justice reform.
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is one of the great misnomers about the civil rights movement is literally what we call it, simply the civil rights movement, because African Americans have been struggling for more than just civil rights, rights that are granted and guaranteed by government, but they've also been struggling for basic human rights or natural rights, rights that all people are entitled to by function of simply breathing, by birth. Some might call them God-given rights. And so, when we just call it civil rights, I mean, it's a name that has been adopted, we lose those human rights goals and objectives, which ties in, I think, directly to the subject matter of criminal justice reform and the questions of the denial of not only civil rights, but also these natural rights, human rights, to those who have been incarcerated, those who are put under the watch of the state, if you will. And so there really has never been a distinction among African Americans, and not only in the 50s and 60s, but literally dating back to the era of slavery, where African Americans are like, yeah, we need these basic civil rights, but we're also talking about human rights. So that combination has always been there. And I will also say this, there's never a moment. One of the things I like to leave my students with, and one of my former students is now Megan Duvall, who's about to be a public defender. You actually met her, about to be a public defender down in Philly. Is the persistence of Black resistance. In other words, there's never a time that African Americans have not been fighting for equality, have not been fighting for freedom, a literal freedom from slavery, but then also to secure these basic rights that all people are entitled to, whether enslaved or free, human rights or civil rights after 1865.
Powerful. And, you've talked about this before, and it's probably one of my most quoted statements that you have said. You talk about the constellation of the civil rights movement. Yeah. It's a constellation over time. And I think what's so powerful is that you see all these different stars make up the civil rights movement, from Rosa Parks to MLK to Malcolm X, some of the people we're going to speak about today. But also the constellations may shift in the sky and appear and disappear, but they're constant. That there's something that happens over time, and it's the people that take up the charge. So how much, when people think of the civil rights movement, they really think about voting rights. They think about those base civil liberties that people had been denied. That's such a powerful story around the civil rights movement. But a key part of the civil rights movement was that criminal justice reform. And one of the, we'll all know, if you don't know me, I love primary sources. I can go down a rabbit hole on primary sources forever. And one of the ones that I was just reading last week was around the Jeremiah Reeves, a young man in Mississippi. Can you tell us a little bit about that moment of protest from MLK and kind of the connection between criminal justice reform, and not looking about the guilt or the innocence of the person, but just saying we have some human dignity and we have some human rights, regardless of if we've committed a crime or not?
Yeah, so one of the things that we see African American activists taking up is the pursuit of justice. Certainly, and this all belongs on a continuum, right? I mean, during the era of slavery, we get 250 years of slavery, 100 or so while the United States is a nation itself. But during the era of slavery, African Americans were denied justice within the courts. They could not testify against white people. They could not sit on juries. And so after emancipation, one of the things that African Americans are determined to get is justice, equal justice before the law, and full participation. And that is denied them. There's this moment of Reconstruction where African Americans are enfranchised, Black men are enfranchised, but that is quickly taken away. And so as we transition into the turn of the 21st century, or turn of the 20th century, African Americans are continuing to be exploited through the criminal justice system. And one of the things that happens is the unequal application of the law, unequal application of punishment. Martin Luther King in 1959 is echoing the hue and cry and the demand for justice for one of many, a fellow by the name of Jeremiah Reeves, who was executed for raping a white woman. And King delivers this powerful, in Alabama, King delivers this powerful speech in which he says, listen, one, there's doubts about his guilt. And there always been sort of doubts about the accusation of African-American men who were committing sexual assault. That was a long trope that was used to sort of punish and to keep underfoot African-Americans. But he said, setting aside questions of innocence or guilt, there is the equal application of the law, right? He said, wait a minute. White men have been sexually assaulting and raping Black women for generations. And go unpunished, never mind being executed for it. And so he's using this example, he's using this case to say, wait a minute, all people are entitled to equal application of the law. That is critical. And then also raising the question of the humanity of capital punishment. Certainly if it's being applied unequally, and if it's being applied in this instance and in many other instances illegitimately. But it wasn't just Dr. King Curry who was interested in criminal justice reform and reforming the criminal legal system. Folk like Rosa Parks, for example, gets her start as an activist, not in 1955 when she refuses to give up her seat in Montgomery, Alabama, triggering what many will consider the start of the modern civil rights movement, but in the 1930s, as she's working to seek justice for the Scottsboro boys, 9 African-American youth in Alabama who are wrongly and falsely accused of rape, again, a sexual assault, and sentenced to die, sentenced to kill, be prison in Alabama, to be electrocuted. And she is part of the group of folk who are rallying to get justice for them. And they're eventually, after a decades-long struggle, able to get them off of death row. It doesn't stop there. She then continues in the 1940s as the secretary of the Montgomery branch of the NAACP, seeking justice for Black women, such as Recy Taylor, Black women who are victims of sexual assault by white folk, by white men who go unpunished, crimes that go uninvestigated. And so this idea of, wait a minute, we have to deal with the criminal legal system, we have to bring about reform, we have to bring about justice, is inseparable from the civil rights activism or the activism of even the most notable civil rights activists who we like to celebrate solely as voting rights activists, or solely as those who were seeking desegregation and public accommodation.
And I think that's so unbelievably powerful because we single story people in history all the time. It's like we can't give them the just dues of all the work that they've done. You get one story, you get one moment, and here's where it is, and we kind of organize. And I know that's how our brains work. It's easy for our brains to compartmentalize people and make them simple, but it also doesn't do them justice for the work that they have done and the way that they impact our lives. And thank you so much for bringing up Recy Taylor. If you don't know the story of Recy Taylor, talking so much about people who are victimized and trying to find a way to find justice. And sometimes that justice isn't found for themselves, but really, what are those rights of the victim and how can those rights be pulled forward? So really unpacking the single story of people that we do know and layering in the stories of people that we don't know. So really powerful. And you pulled up two big other ideas there, is that the civil rights movement is asking for the rule of law. They're asking for the rule of law, for law to be followed equally. And that always pulls me back to the Colored People's Conventions and even-handed justice. We were looking at an article here about a month ago about an incident in Philadelphia, and the prosecutor said, we're looking for even-handed justice. And that is this echo that we hear over time about how do we find justice in America, both for the people who are wrongly convicted or overly prosecuted, but also people who are victims. And that is that echo over time that we need to push for. So many powerful stories. Again, we were smiling before the program started that we're never going to get through all these names. We could be here for hours and days. But as we dive into this, please ask your questions in the chat and the Q&A, and I'll pull them in. But I'd love to kind of take a look and a focus on two more people that were incarcerated and the work that they did for criminal justice reform. You can add in more people as you go, Professor Jeffries, but I'd like to hit upon Malcolm X and George Jackson as well. Both people sometimes that aren't always seen as the heroes that we see Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr.
Yeah, well, so, one of you mentioned earlier how I like to describe, and I think is a useful framing of what the civil rights movement was, and this sort of constellation, not only of people, and so we need to add to the constellation, not only the great names and the Baptist ministers of Martin Luther King, but then also those who are located outside the South, in the North, or Malcolm X, those who are located in the West, somebody like a George Jackson, women, working class people, poor folk. But within that constellation, another way to think about that constellation, this constellation of stars, is to look at those stars as different places. And the movement happens in different places. And when you look up at the night sky, sometimes you can't always see every star, but the sky is covered with stars. They're burning at different intensities. So if we lived long enough, we might be able to see the star that we can't see now. And it's the same thing when we think about sites of activism. One of the sites of activism that we don't always see is within prisons themselves. They are a part of that constellation. It burns the intensity at which we see prison activism occurring is dependent upon time. And so you mentioned, for example, Malcolm X. Malcolm X will enter prison in Massachusetts in the late 1940s. Will gain his freedom in the early to mid 1950s. When he goes in, what he experiences, the kind of transformation that takes place is really a personal one. It's a personal one connected with his involvement and his embrace of the Nation of Islam and Elijah Muhammad, and it's really a story of reform. As he's coming into this period of understanding. And often we leave it there, particularly with the Nation of Islam and those who were pursuing sort of religious rights. Malcolm was struggling for his own sort of knowledge and understanding, but this really foreshadows what would come in the next 2 or 3 decades and beyond, of particularly Muslims who are incarcerated and people who would embrace Islam, fighting and advocating for basic religious liberties and the right to practice their worship or their religious beliefs within the carceral state. And so Malcolm is sort of this individual, but once he leaves prison, once he gains his freedom, he becomes part of a movement on the outside that is helping those who are on the inside, led mainly by those who are on the inside, particularly Muslims, who are saying, listen, I have a right to read the Quran. I have a right to pray 5 times a day, and the like. And so Malcolm really foreshadows this. And the other person that you mentioned, George Jackson, is a young brother out west in California who gets incarcerated, and he's sort of the flip side. We have those like Malcolm who, while they are incarcerated, are really working on sort of self-liberation. Right. I mean, they're organizing around, well, how can I better myself in these conditions? When we get to George Jackson, while he's incarcerated, he's thinking big picture. He's writing about the carceral state. He's talking about, well, what does it mean to be here as an individual and losing these basic rights, and what can I do, and how do we make sense of the prison industrial complex, writing in the late 60s and in the early 1970s. And of course, he is eventually killed in sort of these dubious circumstances, murdered while in prison. And hell, he's there for under dubious circumstances anyway. I mean, part of the assault on Black activists that occurs in the 1960s and early 1970s. But they really represent these sort of two kinds of experiences. One, the individual experience, but then the other of reform and sort of a blossoming despite conditions. But the other who's in there saying, look, I got to fight not just for myself, but for others who find themselves in similar situations and circumstances. But then also the writings of George Jackson are really powerful as he's in Soledad prison. The writings are powerful because he's also shining a light on conditions on the inside that many people on the outside were just unaware of. I mean, one of the things, if I can add ever so quickly, one of the things that is important to understand when we think about sort of activism and how prisons have been used as we move into the civil rights era of the 50s and 60s, those who wanted to maintain racial segregation, who wanted to maintain Jim Crow, they used prisons as a threat. They used jail as a threat, right? Because jails was someplace you did not want to go, and being branded as a quote unquote convict, being branded as a felon, being branded as somebody who had spent time in prison was to be a badge of dishonor. One of the things that the civil rights movement does that flips this on its head, people like Bayard Rustin, people like Martin Luther King, people like James Lawson, they say, do not be afraid of prison. Like if you go to prison, certainly for violating an unjust law, that there is no shame in that whatsoever. If you are in prison, even for violating the law, there is no shame in that whatsoever. And so in a way, they take the power of incarceration as a weapon being used to silence those who are fighting for basic civil rights and human rights away. They say, you know what, I will go to prison. Martin Luther King, 1963, letter from Birmingham jail is written in jail, right? I mean, we want to say Ohio passed a recent, or is trying to pass a recent law saying you got to teach the letter from Birmingham jail in the Constitution. Like, yeah, I have a friend who pointed out they want us to teach it, but not the reason why he was in jail, right? And the fact that he's in jail, and what does it mean, and what is the critique that he's offering? But he's taking the power away. Young SNCC activists, when they begin to be arrested for nonviolent direct action demonstrations in 1960 and 1961, they make a decision that if you're going to arrest us, we're going to refuse bail. I mean, one of the things that we see more recently is bail reform, but they're saying, look, we're not going to pay and then reinforce to support this system. We shouldn't be here in the first place. And so they're taking on this idea of incarceration with the phrase and the slogan and the commitment behind jail, no bail. If you arrest us, that's fine. We're going to stay in, and we're going to stay in as long as we can. And so again, flipping, coming out of the civil rights era, flipping sort of this what it meant to have gone to prison, saying, no, you're not going to hold that against us anymore.
Boiling over here with questions and connections, and this is like such a perfect conversation. Somebody was like, oh, you're doing civil rights at Eastern State. I'm like, absolutely. And everything you just said makes such a powerful connection. It holds us to that question, is what is the purpose of prisons? Is it to punish? Is it to reform? Is it to re-engage people as citizens, and when they come out that they have their citizenship? The history of Eastern State is all of those questions, and the reform that was really being looked at when a country is being birthed in liberty. How do we remove people's liberty, remove their freedom, remove their identity in so many ways? And then what is the responsibility for when they return into the community to re-engage as citizens? So there's images here of prisoners being brought in with bags over their heads, and it's a very hard image, and your brain resists. It looks terrible, but there's something behind it, that you were labeled with a number and not a name. So then that scarlet letter is no longer on you. You serve your time, you reform, you give penance, and you come back to your community without that burden. without that stigma. So it really does grapple with those founding questions and the questions that we have today. What is the purpose? And then when citizens return, what is the rights and responsibilities that they have to engage in communities? In a future program, we are absolutely going to dive into voting rights for people who are incarcerated, while they're detained, all these questions, and then after incarceration as well. But thank you so much for bringing up those big ideas, those big theories that we need to tease out and answer for ourselves and unpack. Let's go to, I think we have like a couple more minutes to do some cases that are connected to that. And I have to be honest with you, when I was, doing some research on this and looking at what are some of the cases I wanted to do, I absolutely wanted to talk about the natural right, your right to a religion, your right to worship. That is a natural right, no matter where you are. No government shall take that away from you. And so that really goes to that question about Muslim prisoners and their right to worship and their right to read the Quran. And you dive into some of the cases that are out of New York, and it's a person named Martin Storsty, and the case around being able to read the Quran and solitary confinement. The case, and I'll drop it in the chat, or Jerome will drop it in the chat, is Pierce via Lavallere. But what I want to really go through there is take a step back before this case and look at some of the cases that come in around 1871 through the Virginia courts. And there's a case called Ruffin v. Commonwealth. And I am blown away by these statements of the judges that make statements in the court record that says a prisoner has a consequence of his crime, not only forfeits his liberty, but all his personal rights except those which the law in its humanity accords to him. There are years that none of these cases are even heard by the courts because people who are incarcerated have no rights. And that's almost the opposite of natural rights and liberty, that it's not possible, that no government can give these rights, therefore no government can take them away. So can you kind of unpack these two cases and the struggle for even these cases to be heard?
Yeah, the 13th Amendment, when slavery, a lot of times
where to start?
Where to start? Like, Dr. Jeffries, why are you always talking about slavery? I'm like, this is the founding. This is where all this madness comes from, right? So slavery was the complete deprivation of both civil and human rights of African Americans, of African people. If you were enslaved, you lacked, according to the state, all rights that any person that the state can guarantee or grant, or that nature can grant. When slavery is abolished, then Ava DuVernay's documentary film, The 13th, that looked at mass incarceration, it's titled The 13th because it's this reference to the 13th Amendment. And of course, it's the 13th Amendment that abolishes slavery, except for punishment of a crime. Except for punishment of a crime. So, but what is slavery? Slavery is this system designed to extract labor, but it extracts labor by denying these basic rights. So when you fast forward to the case out of Virginia, so the Virginia Social Studies teachers and the Virginia Council for Social Studies, I'm sure, will do wonderful work around this. It's just really giving voice, giving explanation to what is in the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment says slavery is allowable, except as a punishment of a crime. And then the Ruffin case is like, well, look, basically you're forfeiting all rights once the state takes control over your life. And that pretty much holds sway for 3/4 of a century. And in the context of the Jim Crow era, where you have, particularly coming out of the South and the Southern states, they're looking for ways to reestablish control over Black labor, right? And so one of the things that we have to understand about sort of the rise of modern prisons and the rise of sort of policing coming out of the Reconstruction era, particularly in the South, is that it's designed to recreate and reestablish labor controls. We cannot separate sort of the rise of 20th century modern prisons and imprisonment from the desire of former enslavers in the South to exert control over Black labor. And so you get a ruling like you get in the Virginia case, in which they're saying, nope, anybody who's being imprisoned, and read Black people there, right, surrender and forfeit all rights, which then allows them not only to be denied the right to worship and all these other things, but that means that their labor can be exploited, that they can be leased out, convict leasing, that they do not need to be paid, they do not need to be treated with any type of equality. I mean, so that surrender is connected to this longer history and desire to exploit the labor and extract labor up from African Americans. Fast forward, and once we move into the 1950s, and again, the activism of those who would believe in Islam and those who, whether it's the traditional Islam or the Nation of Islam, they're saying, hold on, how is it possible that I can surrender and forfeit all of my rights? Like, what are you saying? Like, how in a civil society does this make any sense whatsoever? And so we see a number of cases coming out of New York. Not surprising, because this is also where New York and Illinois, these were places where the Nation of Islam in particular was strong. And so you see these cases coming out in which those who are incarcerated are saying, wait a minute, I have to believe that I am entitled, I have a right to worship as I please and worship as I want, especially when you're allowing others who were Christians to be able to do this. So the selective application of rights then leads a number of these incarcerated persons to file lawsuits, often on their own, to get some modicum of justice. And I think it's also worth pointing out that many of these suits weren't just, I'm being denied the right to worship as I please, but also I am being punished for attempting to worship as I please. I'm being punished because I'm asking for access to the Quran. And so it leads not only to what rights am I entitled to, but why am I being put in solitary confinement for a year and a half? Simply for asking, simply for agitating, as they would say, for the right to worship as I please. And so that's once the Supreme Court finally says, yeah, this doesn't make any sense, right? Like, this one, the cruel and unusual punishment of punishing people for simply trying to worship, and that there are, in fact, it takes almost a century, but there are, in fact, some rights. I wish the court would go a little further, but there are, in fact, some basic natural rights that all people are entitled to, even if they are incarcerated and under the care, if you will, control of the state.
Really helpful, and to kind of like unpack this understanding, and just again, really fascinating to see all this movement start to take hold and change in the 1950s, and that long to kind of get to that point. So when we look at these pieces, Gail, one of our students, was like, can you help me define natural rights? Because there's, sometimes these words get used in different ways, and we're talking about like a fundamental tenet of democracy, these ideas like popular sovereignty, that the people are sovereign over the government, natural rights, and rule of law. So can you kind of just help her unpack, what are we talking about when we say natural rights?
Well, certainly, I think we use interchangeably natural rights, human rights, and God-given rights. And so, for those who don't practice a particular religious belief, there ain't no God, right? And so the natural rights language is really more encompassing. It's saying that all people, regardless of their birth, regardless of their station in life, are entitled to certain rights simply because they breathe, simply because they exist. For some people, they're God-given rights, they're inalienable rights that no government under any circumstance should take away from people, because the government doesn't grant them. There are certain rights that government does not grant and government can't take away that all people are entitled to. So by nature, these are rights that are conferred upon people. And so in that category of natural rights, human rights, God-given rights, inalienable rights, those, really constitute those things that everyone should be entitled to. When we begin to talk about civil rights and civil liberties, that's where the state and the government comes into play. So they overlap at times, but one of the ways we can think about it is, there's nothing in the US Constitution says anything about housing. Nothing in the US Constitution even says anything about education or literacy. But we would say that these are natural rights. Everybody's entitled to decent housing. Everybody's entitled to shelter, right? You can look at the United Nations sort of lists, these sort of natural rights or human rights, a list of 40 or so that really point to things that all people are entitled to, rather than things like sort of civil rights, the right to vote. That's not necessarily God-given. That's something that the state decides is a form of participating in the sort of the function of the government. So we really distinguish between those two, although on the natural rights side, they have many different names.
And that's fantastic. And people do, just so all of our attendees are aware, people do parse them out a little differently too. So you can get in a debate which one falls in natural rights, which one falls in human rights. But I really also appreciate that you uncoupled civil rights and civil liberties, because that is a conversation we have to have a lot of no, that falls in the civil rights category. That one falls in the civil liberties category. Right. And when you Google search old documents, the word civil liberties is never going to come up. It really comes to fruition during the Reconstruction time period, and then gets coined, I think, after that. But language moves with people, so it gets a little tricky. But thank you also for just giving me an opportunity to drop a John Locke link in there, which I will always do whenever I can. So let's go to some questions, because these questions are fantastic, and I'm going to toggle back and forth between the Q&A, and I did see some in the chat as well. So Trish, and I feel like I'm going to butcher this word, but Trish asked a really good question. So the power and the discretion of the prosecutor, how has that worked over time in ensuring even-handed justice? And this one's a moving target depending on what year, what season, and which prosecutor. So could you talk a little bit about those questions? We tend to look at justice and fairness in the justice system, and we think about crime, we think about people committing crimes, we think about victims, we think about police. But what we need to kind of take that extra layer in and say, what are all these other social pieces to this? And it is prosecutors, it is defense attorneys, and the good, having good defense and good prosecution, but it's also the judges. It's also the systems that are put into place. Even people can look towards the education system as well. So sorry, that's a loaded big question for you. Maybe just start with prosecutors.
It's an important one, because it's essential that we look at all aspects of the criminal legal system and the roles that judges play, as you pointed out, the role that defense lawyers play. But I would argue, and I'm certainly not the first and not alone in saying, that prosecutors are probably the most powerful people within the criminal legal system, because they're deciding, who's getting charged. They're deciding, what crimes constitute a crime, if you will, right? I mean, one of the things that we've seen with prosecutorial reform is the refusal to prosecute, some in Philadelphia, certainly in New York early on, low-level offenses like marijuana possession, right? I mean, for so long, we have seen more recently, possession of marijuana has constantly, people are serving life sentences under 3 strikes in states like California for marijuana possession. And so prosecutors are deciding whether or not this is worthy of the kind of prosecution. And so prosecutors decide not only, so what's going to be charged, but who gets charged. I mean, and the power of the prosecutor is not quite infinite, but my goodness, in many ways, they're more powerful than judges. And so, it's not a surprise either, to fast forward into the current moment, that there is so much talk and tension and battling now about prosecutors and who should be a prosecutor and who gets to be and what are they pushing for. It's very politicized because of the power of the position, but then also how political this idea of law and order is. And crime has been declining, certainly violent crime, but you would never know that depending upon which news channels that you were looking at. But prosecutors played a big role in deciding not only who gets prosecuted, but really defining what crime is and who gets punished.
Really powerful. And now, like, looking also, there was a bit of a reform movement through some prosecutors, and now with crime that was on the increase during COVID and after COVID, there's a pullback on that as well. So it is unbelievably political. But you think of the prosecutors that wound up being Supreme Court justices. You think of the prosecutors that became governors. So it is a very political role in American history, at least for the last 100 years, I'd say 50 years, 75 years. Tori asked a really good question, and I love this because it brings us back to a part of this work isn't just about learning about the history, it's about asking questions, learning more, understanding it, and then taking an active role in looking at our policies that are utilized and our practice that is utilized. So the question is, what things can the public do to positively influence a prisoner's staff and administration to do better or to be supported more?
I think one of the things that we can all do is inform ourselves more, not only about sort of the criminal legal process, in other words, who's getting charged, what kinds of sentences are people facing. So, I mean, like we need light on every aspect of the criminal legal system. There's so much attention right now to policing, and to be sure, there is no mass incarceration without mass arrests. But what are we asking police to do? What are we telling them, is an acceptable sort of crime, if you will, to be arrested for? In a way, I like to say crime is not what people do. Crime is what Black people get arrested for, right? When we think about, for example, sort of drug possession and the like, and disproportionate numbers in which people are being both arrested and prosecuted for drug possession and the like, we see that disproportionality. So we got to focus on police. We got to focus on these prosecutors and the like. But then also, once folk are incarcerated, we can't just say, okay, well, that's it. We'll see you on the outside. We have to make sure that they are receiving fair and humane treatment on the inside. We can't allow coming from New York City. We got the Statue of Liberty, but we also got Rikers Island, right? Which is unbelievably crazy, right? In terms of the conditions that people are being held there, in there, and they've been for literally for generations. But we also need to think about bail reform. The fact that you have people in jail being held for years, literally for years, without being charged with a crime because they can't afford bail, it doesn't make any sense. So what can we do as folk who are on the outside? We can be informed, and we can demand of our elected officials. We can demand of administrators of the criminal legal system and prisons and jails full transparency. What is going on? And that's our right as citizens on the outside, to demand to know what is going on the inside. How are people being treated? What rights are being protected, and what is being denied them? So that when it's over, when folk are released and are able to come outside, the other thing that we can also demand is that we don't continue to punish them, right? That we stop with the collateral consequences of continuing disenfranchisement and job discrimination. Of course, Michelle Alexander writes wonderfully, about this discriminated class of those who carry that scarlet letter of having been incarcerated. The one class of people that we're still, them and immigrants, those who are undocumented, the two groups of people who we are legally allowed to discriminate against. And we have to stop that. And one of the ways we can stop that is by being aware of it and then demanding of those who we are electing, because so many in these positions are elected officials, saying, nope, we're not going to do that anymore. How are we going to reform this? And how are you going to reform this so that the society as a whole is a more just, fair, and better place?
I think that's unbelievably important. And I just, as we're wrapping up, I want to just really echo your words about shining the light. That is, so much of the criminal justice system is hidden. There isn't a light shined on it. And so to have true and just laws, to have fair application of the laws, and to have the rule of law, you need to have transparency, that the laws aren't hidden and the process isn't hidden. But I also think that you really call on all of us to say, how do we ensure that we are welcoming people back who were incarcerated and back into our community as citizens, as community members, as friends, as siblings? You know, this impacts so many people's lives. And we need to balance and understand that this is a systems issue, and that we also need to look at all, you know, all perspectives here too. I've been really fascinated, and I think one of our future programs is going to look at how do we really find justice for people? How do we ensure that justice is served and that people are then re-engaged in the community, but at the same time that there is an ability to reconnect, to have forgiveness, to have real apologies, not verbal apologies. That's not what an apology is, but that we have the ability to have those restorative practices. And that means we need to do stuff in our community. We need to support people and victims' rights, but we also need to support people who are quite honest about the wrong that they may have done, but that burden should not stay with them. Right? They are allowed to regain and find their freedom and hold on to it, because it is theirs and it is their right to have that as well. But it begins with shining a light on the system, ensuring that the system is at its baseline fair and just for all of us.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor Jeffries. This was a fantastic conversation.
No, thank you for having me. I'm so glad that you're starting off January with this conversation. And I know you're going to continue it in various ways and various iterations going forward. So great conversation. Thank you so much, and continue the great work at Eastern.
Thank you so much. And everybody, we will definitely have Professor Jeffries back, because this is part one of probably a 10-part series. But I just dropped in the chat, we're going to have this program once a month. Next month, we're going to look at the First Amendment, which is a natural right in prisons. Not all part of it, but parts of the First Amendment are natural rights in prisons. And then, of course, we're going to look at women behind bars, which is one of the largest populations growing in America, are women and young girls who are incarcerated in March, and then policing, and then the 13th Amendment. So, Professor Jeffries, you will be back quite soon. Thank you so much for this. What a great way to kick it off with you. And thank you all of you for joining us today.